Morning. I'm Greg Pretty, a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest. We're meeting this morning to talk about security in the Arabian Gulf, and specifically how the region has changed so much as a result of the conflict of the last 2 years. And as everyone is aware, Israel has emerged from a lot of this with some victories quite ascendant in the region. Hezbollah undermined, Iran undermined, and that has changed, the power balances quite a bit. So I thought it would be useful to ask some experts on Gulf Arab states' foreign policies, Saudi being most important, but the others are too, for a view from the Gulf and how they're looking at this in terms of their own interests and how they relate to the U.S., Israel, and the rest of the world, largely in security terms after these big changes in the layout, in the landscape of the region. We have with us today two experts on security and foreign policies of the Gulf Arab states. Dr. Aziz Al-Ghassian is a senior non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum. He's a researcher from Saudi Arabia who focuses on the kingdom's foreign policy. He's known in particular as a specialist in Saudi-Israeli as well as Arab-Israeli relations. He attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and holds a PhD from the University of Essex. Omar Karim is an associate fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies. His research focuses on Saudi foreign policy and politics, in particular the Saudi regional policy outlook and the broader geopolitics of the Middle East. And Aziz, I'll let you lead off with your introductory remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Greg. And it's good to join you and good to join Ahmad, of course. I would have to say, I very much appreciate your introductory words because indeed, I think there's a great deal of anticipation to see, what will be coming out of this kind of real turmoil that's taking place. Still the war in Gaza is raging, and the issue is, I don't think many people really realize it would last this long. I think there's a few things when it comes to, I think the most pressing issue, which is, I think, the Gaza humanitarian crisis right now, and also the situation in this Palestinian-Israeli question as well. For me, I think this is something that's going to change the geopolitical, and also will influence, I think, the security landscape, in my opinion, of the region, the Palestinian, the Gaza war, because it illustrated a few things. It illustrated, firstly, of the immense spillover effect that we've seen. We have 4 wars that came out of this particular sphere, this of the Israeli-Gaza war, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And time and again, I think, more and more people have spoken about this, and they have said, no, this is a question that's kind of, it's nonchalantly they put aside. They're trying to say this is no longer important for the Gulf countries. And at times, I think these respective relations with Israel kind of help or contribute towards making these kinds of arguments. I think the Abraham Accords, people will always refer and point to the Abraham Accords as kind of this proof that, the Palestinian-Israeli issue can be circumnavigated. But I think the can has been kicked down the road once too many times, and I don't think it could be kicked down the road any longer. I think it showed that it does have significant security issues regionally, but I think the thing that is really important to keep your eye on, that we all have to keep our eye on, is how this is going to influence domestic security throughout the region. In my opinion, I think this is something that's, these images are incredibly painful, and I think it's becoming more and more clear that it's something that just, it has to be dealt with. So I think the security landscape, the security concerns domestically and regionally is something very, something we have to keep our eye on. I think when it comes to, the situation with Iran and the recent war, the 12-day war, there's been a lot of speculation and there's been a lot of rhetoric regarding kind of how the Gulf states were actually secretly happy that they are, very much wishing Israel to keep going but will perform something else outside. And I think this is very far from the truth. I don't think this is really the case, because I think what this is that while there's no love loss with the Iranian missile systems, with the Iranian threat, but the reason why I think there was a great deal of anxiety from the Gulf states was because precisely this was, this was provoking a security threat that we could have been at the forefront of. We were basically the front line of two other poles wars. And so when one puts it in that way, we get to see that why the Gulf states, and in particular Saudi, is anxious. And then I think the last point that I would mention is I think the role of the United States. I think when it came to Saudi Arabia's or the Gulf states' positionality on the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, I think there was anxiety, but I think there was also confidence that their proactive and preemptive diplomacy with relations with Iran kind of gave them that shield away, and it from the ramifications of the war between the two, and it seemed to have worked. The question is, what would happen if the United States enters into the question, enters into the fold? And I think, in my opinion, this is where it became a lot more complicated for the security of the region. Why? Because for me, while the military operation was somewhat successful to slow down the Iranian nuclear program, and it did not eliminate it. It was perhaps, I would say, a definition of what the Saudis and GCC states find concerning about military operations of the United States, because it was a one and done. It was a short-term intervention, and then we will leave. And therefore, if I could say it theoretically, maybe a tactical intervention, but the GCC states are worried about regional ramifications or the strategic ramifications of these kinds of interventions. So these are the things that they, all these things are calculated. And I think in the past few weeks, a lot of the anxieties and grievances have been materialized and illustrated. So I'll just leave it there, and then we could talk afterwards about other things.
Omar?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the honor to share this panel with experts like Aziz. What I will say is that the security order, we have seen a lot in the last 2 decades since the invasion of Iraq, and afterwards the conflict between, I'm talking about this from a Gulf and Saudi perspective, the conflict, 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, the 2009 conflict between Hamas and Israel, the Arab Spring protests, and then afterwards the 2015 JCPOA between Iran and the United States. Of course, the comments from the Obama administration about Arab Gulf states as free riders, and then we see things turning with the election of President Donald Trump, and also the Gulf split, a massive development within the political horizons of the Arab Gulf Peninsula, and the 2019 attack on uptake and Kuwait oil infrastructure within Saudi Arabia. And to some extent, I think the damage was considerable to hold off oil production to a certain degree. And after that, we see the consecutive rapprochements between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and Saudi Arabia and Iran. So there has been a comprehensive turnaround in the regional security situation. And the picture we see today of, you can say, the Gulf regional security environment is very different from, let's say, 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. From a Saudi perspective, I would say that there are certain things which are important, and these developments concern Saudi leadership and Saudi decision makers particularly. One is their engagement with Iran, which has progressed to a degree considerably well, if we may say that. But of course, it is kind of an uneasy piece, if we say, or a piece where there's a lot of calculation involved rather than um, a lot of mutual trust, as we can say this. The other thing is that the current nature of Saudi-Iran engagement has happened also, or is now happening also in the backdrop of Israeli-Iran conflict. And this is something which was not in the equation before. Of course, there was a conflict between Iranian proxies and Israel, but that scenario has changed. Now the conflict is directly between Iran and Israel. And if we go on a little bit on this, we see that first there were calculated, you can say, relatively conveyed and mutually agreed upon attacks between each other, between Iran and Israel. But the second episode was much bigger, much more destructive, and much more, you can say, it could have an effect which was much more regional when Israel and Iran again came into conflict. From a Saudi perspective, there is something satisfying that Saudi Arabia didn't become part of the conflict. It didn't. It was not an avenue or a target specifically from the Iranian side, and it also didn't allow Israel to use its airspace or to project in any manner that Saudi Arabia is a party against Iran with Israel. However, considering the first and now the second episode of this conflict, we can argue that if this conflict lingers on and there is a third episode of Iran and Israel conflict, I'm not sure how long can the Arab Gulf states in general can stay out of this, because we saw in the last episode that Iran, as a retaliation to the American strikes, attacked Qatar, or the American base in Qatar. But for all reasons, that was a practical attack on Qatari, or a violation of Qatari sovereignty and Qatari territory. So this gives us a little bit of a question and a headache that there are a lot of American assets in the region, and we cannot rule out that next time this happens, America will not become part of this conflict, and Iran will not retaliate on these assets. The second point is we go back to the 2019 attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. That a lot of people talk about Iran-Israel conflict getting worse and Iran trying to block the Strait of Hormuz. I think Iran probably is not going to do that, because there's a much higher price. Syria has Iranian proxy. It has now effectively become integrated into the Arab fold, and the way things are going, I would say that it's pretty much within the Saudi sphere of influence now. The improvement in relations between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, although Saudi Arabia, as we can see from perspectives coming from the Saudi kingdom, that there is some concern about the expansion of Turkish influence within the region and the nature of relationship between the new people in power in Damascus and Ankara. But I think that the in the backdrop of the improved Saudi-Turkish relationship, Syria is to be a massive gain, both by Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And I think that this gives Riyadh a lot of confidence in terms of the general regional balance of power, specifically vis-a-vis Iran. But now the other situation, or the third point, as we can say, is the expansionist, you can say, the expansionist strategy or the expansionist outlook for unfolding within Israel in the wake of its, you can say, profound military performativity after Gaza. So it appears that the Israeli decision makers they're on a kind of a roll here, and they think that they can just dominate strategically the whole region, and nobody is going to stop them. So yes, Gaza was basically more of a theatrical performance of Israeli military might and superiority, and now they can do the same. They did the same in Iran, and quite comprehensively, they decimated the Iranian top nuclear and security leadership, and they could have actually done the same with the Iranian political leadership. And considering their intelligence ingress within Iran, that kind of rounded it all off. The same has been the case in Syria. I think that it was very much clear that the new Syrian leaders, Saudi leadership, the Turks, everyone thought that new Syria is not going to go into conflict with Israel, and some sort of a status quo will prevail. And this is why this, and considering this debate in the backdrop of Saudi confidence and the political investment within new Syria, specifically when MBS himself personally convinced President Donald Trump to lift sanctions from Syria. This is a very alarming situation from a Riyadh perspective, that Israel just went down and bombed the periphery of the presidential palace in Damascus, and basically giving a message to the new Syrian leadership, or also to the broader region, that you follow our strategic outlook. Whatever we think should happen or should go on, you cannot go against it. And from a Riyadh perspective, this is really problematic. And I think this is where, as Aziz was saying, that the war in Gaza, it was the first, you can say, if we can say, a wedge, and a very decisive wedge between Saudi Arabia and Israel, or I would say the people in power in Israel. The events in Iran, but also specifically in Syria, have created a second comprehensive wedge between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And how I see things, I would say that specifically in the backdrop of the conference yesterday organized by France and Saudi Arabia for the acceptance of Palestinian statehood, I would say that from my perspective, the dynamics I am seeing, it looks like the Saudi Arabia is increasingly balancing against Israel alongside Turkey, alongside its European partners, using its soft power, using its diplomacy, and whatever it's on its disposal, rather than any longer engaging with Israel. And I think that this is a really important point for power corridors in DC, that your two of your or three of your primary partners, Turkey is a NATO member, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they both are now actively trying to balance out whatever Israel is trying to do in the region, while Israel, on the other hand, it's completely disregarding any perspectives coming from Ankara or Riyadh. And I can say that as compared to maybe the previous Israeli strategies of trying to engage, because when you engage with another party, you basically are sending signals that we do respect some of your strategic red lines and some of your broader regional outlooks. But now what I can see is that Israel is completely ignoring and to some extent undermining both from a Riyadh perspective and an Ankara perspective. And also there is another change which we saw on display during President Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, where the Arab Gulf states were actually able to directly engage and link up with with the U.S. president. While we have seen that traditionally there had been an understanding in the Arab Gulf that if you need to gain influence in DC, you need to be close with a certain lobbying group or a certain section within DC, and then you can increase your sway within American power circles. But this is not the case anymore. You just directly, at least for the Trump administration, you just directly engage with him, and that engagement pays, as we have seen in the case of Saudi Arabia being able to convince Trump to lift sanctions from Syria. And I think that this was, from an Israeli perspective, a worrying trend, because they thought that, okay, they are doing this with Syria. What if they are able to do this with Iran as well? So we need to put our foot down, and we need to create realities on ground by the sheer display of our force. And I think that this has really disturbed Saudi decision makers, but not just Saudi decision makers, also the power corridors to some extent in Abu Dhabi and in Doha. And I think that ultimately this will translate into the Gulf's dealings with the United States. I think that this is the general regional environment where perhaps Riyadh would have thought that with the fall of Assad regime in Syria, the weakening of Iranian proxy network of its forward defense strategy, we could actually now have a more even-ended relationship with Iran, and we can kind of try to make Iran part of the regional political and security infrastructure while keeping our own hands open. But these sudden maneuvers by Israel now show that Saudi Arabia has to again worry about the third power, and this is something which we have not seen happening within the regional political sphere, because before Israel was happy to just establish its military or aerial superiority in one or another event, and then just back down to its own kind of understood regional security sphere of influence, which largely was within the Arab Levant. But now it's extending to the shores of the Gulf waterways at one end, and northern Syria at the other end, Iraq. So all of the Middle East, as we know of it, is pretty much a playground for Israeli strategic security playbook. And Riyadh, I can say, in my understanding, is not happy with this and is not comfortable with this.
Thank you, Omar. I'm going to take questions from the audience, and you can submit those via Zoom. But I'll start out with a couple of questions of my own. First, I wanted to go back to Aziz, and toward the end of your intro remarks, you had mentioned the strategic ramifications of this. Could you just elaborate on that for a few minutes?
Sure. So I think there's just a lot of, what I meant by strategic ramifications. I think for me, this kind of comes from the my attempt, or the attempts of trying to understand what Saudi wanted from kind of a strong military relationship with the United States in regards to addressing this regional security aspects. And time and again, I think we've seen, there's a long history of Saudis wanting, of course, to address its regional issues, but it was, I think, a lot of the times it was a bit dependent on what what the U.S. action would be, and that was the strategy. A lot of the strategy was dependent on kind of, in other words, an external force, namely the United States, and they didn't know. Sometimes they would be willing to join, sometimes they won't be willing to join. Sometimes the extent of the U.S. Intervention or military operations, there was a lot of doubt, and there's a lot of lack of clarity. For me, when it comes to 2019, like what Omar said, this was a change, and I think the Saudi calculus. And then they said, you know what? We are actually going to strategize and take things a lot more into our own hands now. And we're going to try to make things basically, to address this, to reduce or mitigate the strategic ramifications. And what do I mean by that? Saudi Arabia now has embarked on a process of trying to reframe relations in the Middle East. That's what it tried to do with Iran. That's what it did with, like what Umar said, in the Gulf, to end the Gulf with Qatar in 2021. That's what it tried to do with Turkey. That's what it tried to do also with Israel before the October 7th, by the way. It tried to say, you know what, we're going to try to change this framing of the relationship, and then we're gonna address the issues in the right frame. What the Saudis don't want is to have a to be targeted because of a process that was not in their hands, because of something that was not, it was not something that, because of basically things like Prosperity Guardian, the Operation Prosperity Guardian, or which in, I think, beginning of last year, the many EU states and their navies tried to attack the Houthis and targeted them. And really what you got from the Saudis, the Saudi response was like, well, where were you a few years ago when we were telling you guys this was a threat? And then you stood against us then. So even speaking to kind of diplomats, Western diplomats or European diplomats in Saudi, they were saying, man, we're hearing a lot of "we told you so," from people in Riyadh. And so, and why would they? Because there were tactical measures. Trying to strike the Houthis only would lead to short-term military gains that will not change the fundamentals of the dynamic between of the Houthis. The Houthis are already there. They're not going anywhere. A few months ago, when Donald Trump started his operations against the Houthis, again, there was even speculation, and I'm sure you guys remember, there was reports about that maybe this is an opportunity for Saudi to mobilize its forces and to now, head into Hodeidah and try to capture Hodeidah. And that was just very silly, because here is a strategic operation that all of a sudden ended in a blink of an eye in a decision taken by the Trump administration and the Houthis directly, and all the operations stopped. Now, what would the Saudis' position be had the Saudis joined this operation? And that's what I mean by strategic ramification. This means all the process of rapprochement and all the process of reframing things in the region, reframing their, the regional order, basically, from the Saudi perspective, would have been just wasted. And I think that's really what I'm arguing about the strategic ramifications, because here is an operation indeed by the most important security actor for Saudi Arabia, which is the United States. But there's just too many unfixed variables in which the Saudis will need to build a strategy with the United States or any other actor. So therefore, I think when the strategic ramifications of this is just going to be far too much, and I think that's what the Saudis are trying to avoid. They try to avoid this kind of a lot of the uncertainties, and at the same time, they're also using this opportunity to distance themselves from any of these kind of measures, be it tactical or even limitedly strategic. And I think again, it just the point that I think Omar mentioned, and we keep going back to this. I think 2019 is a real pivotal moment in the Saudi strategic calculus, because I think it showed not only to Saudis, but in particularly to this Saudi leadership, the current Saudi leadership, that came in, with a different worldview than probably the previous era of leaderships in Saudi, and that who were banking a lot on Donald Trump. By the way, they were banking a lot on it, and anybody remember kind of the 2017 reception that the Saudis gave to Donald Trump? I mean, it was really a lavish, over the top, some will say even befitting to the ego of Donald Trump. And what was the intention behind that? The intention was actually something from a play from the Saudi diplomacy playbook, which is, let's invest in Donald Trump without being transactional. Let's invest in him, and once, let's do all this, and once we need Donald Trump, he will be there to act as we need him. The reality is, no, this completely, this changed a lot of the things. So I think, right now, the current Saudi leadership also is, I think, far more bold than I think for the previous eras. So this, this strategy that they've embarked on of trying to shield their regional relations from the whims and the uncertainties of political capitals around the world, internationally, be it in Europe or the United States, is something that they're keen to do. They're trying to change the relationship and make regional relationships more intrinsic, organic, and confined within the region, and protected away from the complexities or complications on the international sphere.
Which, of course, is really difficult in practice to do, but that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
This next question is pretty broad, and it's to both of you. We'll start out with Omar. But back in the Biden administration, there was a view in the United States that we wanted to have a new security architecture, and this was built around a formal agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, trying to get Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, and additional formalization of these ties built around our Gulf Arab partners, tying them to Israel and balancing against a hostile Iran. And so, Omar, what is that view at all relevant anymore? The Trump administration hasn't really gotten explicitly moved away from that, but are any new formal arrangements like that something that they would want to see?
So I think that that sort of atmosphere where we were pretty much before 7th of October 2023, 7th of October was kind of a very strong test to that atmosphere and to that engagement. Because remember that the Abrahamic Accords, in general, they're flouted around mostly for PR reasons and just for news consumptions. But we need to understand that these accords happened not just simply because of the U.S. presence in between the stakeholders, but also after years of engagement between the stakeholders and kind of the stakeholders developing mutual respect for each other, developing certain thresholds of engagement, and then experiencing sort of within that relationship a kind of sort of guarantees from the other side that yes, these are our national strategic outlooks, and the other side is going to respect them, is maybe also going to work with us, and the eventual outcome or the goal will be something which is beneficial for us as well as for the other side. And I think that from a Saudi perspective, this was pretty much something which was there in mind in the minds of the Saudi leadership, and they were very happy that they enacted a rapprochement with Iran. So the Iran factor in between this Israeli engagement with Arab Gulf states or with Saudi Arabia in particular was there, but it would no longer hinder any Israeli-Saudi engagement because Iran could no longer portray or frame Saudi Arabia as an Israeli ally or whatever. And I think that after 7th of October, initially, there was this expectance within Saudi power corridors that Israel will retaliate in a measured and calculated manner. And I mean, realistically speaking, Israel will try to achieve its aims within Gaza from a very realist bent of mind. But what we saw eventually, something which will not eventually make it impossible or more difficult for Saudi Arabia to keep on its engagement with Israeli power circles and with Israel as a state, because we need to understand that keeping up the engagement is to some extent also kind of paving the way for eventual normalization or eventual establishment of diplomatic ties. So when you start this process of engagement, you have actually started moving towards that. Normalization is an end goal, but engagement is something that the relationship has actually practically started. But what we have seen after 7th of October, Israel just went in its own pathway and completely disregarded not just views coming from Saudi Arabia or potential Abrahamic Accord partners, but also from its established allies, whether in Europe or even in sections within the United States. And this now has shown Saudi Arabia that if we are going to invest in this relationship, as Aziz was saying, with Israel, what do we get out of it? Israel is not ready to even give a very sort of very reduced form of anything to Saudi Arabia in terms of political dividends. So Saudi Arabia engages with Israel. Israel carries out a devastating bombing campaign of Gaza and practically enacts a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And Saudi Arabia, okay, we are engaging, but Israel is not listening. So what is the point then of this engagement when actually on the other side, your engagement with Iran has given you certain dividends? Iran honored your territorial sovereignty. Of course, the Qatari thing did happen, but that was because of the American involvement. But otherwise, there was no repercussions from the Iranian side in these multiple rounds of Israel-Iran conflict. Or what about Israel? What are we getting from it, and how it may actually affect our soft power, you can say, within the broader Muslim world? Because I mean, already the Saudi leadership had been pretty much defensive on certain things, and add up the Israel factor, and this would be pretty devastating for their you can say reputation. And I think that spending too much political capital on engagement with Israel, Riyadh understands that this is a self-defeating strategy, which will not really give them anything. And on top of that, the way Israel has postured itself against the new administration in Syria, and is actually trying to very much project an outlook of Syria where Syria has to be a divided, fragmented state, and one which has no centralized authority. It goes completely against Riyadh's vision for regional security and regional order. So if you are engaging with somebody whose regional vision is 180 degrees completely opposite to you, and even is now ridiculing you by saying that if Palestinians want to have a state, they can have a state within Saudi Arabia. It's such a big country. So I mean, MBS doesn't, in my understanding, in my reading of being a student of Saudi foreign policy and politics, the Saudi current leadership, as he said, they are bold in taking uh, decisions which probably previous leaderships would not take, but they are also very mindful of when their political capital and political agency is being undermined by somebody. And I think this is why uh, they have they have not really tried to raise this issue any longer. And the way the Saudi discourse is being projected, it's very clear that they want to reassert and reaffirm their own red lines with regards to Israel.
Aziz, I'm sure you probably have a few things to add to that.
Yes, I do. I very much appreciate what Omar said, and there are just a few things also that I want to say about this whole security architecture, regional architecture, etc. I'll be very honest with you. Maybe I'm not overly convinced of the tangibility or the materialization, the actual materialization of some sort of regional security infrastructure um, that involves Israel explicitly. I think, yes, when it comes to CENTCOM, they are there because it's very much an American-dominated kind of approach. But this whole discussion about Arab NATO, um, Arab NATO, and sort of Israel, and particularly because there's just too many, there are too many complexities within these things. So when you have, for example, within the Gulf, this doesn't seem to be also something that's going to materialize. A security infrastructure within the Gulf is in itself something that's actually very, we're still striving towards that. There's still a lot of things that need to be ironed out, let alone having Israel participate in something like this with all the politics that Omar mentioned, with all the aspects that are going on, because you can't have uh, an infrastructure with all the baggage that Israel and other countries have with it. So for me, I think that's one thing of why I thought this whole idea of regional infrastructure, security infrastructure, I would say, or security architecture, I would say, is still far-fetched. I also think one of the other reasons why it's far-fetched, and I think many people, I think in the US probably are not understanding it, and Israel too much, is this idea that here is a security architecture that's designed to counter Iran. The Gulf states will not want any deal, even when it came from the Saudi-US treaty, to be openly and explicitly against Iran. This is not the case. And many people are baffled. They were saying, but this is against Iran. And they're like, no, we don't want this to be against Iran. Because what this does is that, again, it undoes all that security rapprochement that they're trying to do. But again, a lot of people are just misunderstanding it. They're just saying, no, it must be against Iran. And the third thing that I would say that was, in my opinion, a little bit misleading a lot about the Abraham Accords is that the Abraham Accords was not something that was motivated to counter Iran, in particular the UAE. The UAE-Israel relationship is a bit more organic. There were a lot of things within it. The last thing that they wanted, UAE already had relations with Iran. They always had relations anyway with Iran. And it's very interesting that, they have I mean, they're the ultimate balancers of extremes. And so this whole idea of an Arab-Israeli front vis-a-vis Iran is something that I think is far-fetched. What we do see from the GCC states is an anti-axis or axes that they don't want to be against anybody. And this is the reality of, I think, what they're positioning and what they're trying to communicate. They're trying to communicate the fact that, listen, we are in the middle. We are literally the center of gravity, or we are de facto the center of gravity of the region. Everybody needs to work with us, whoever their projects, whoever has any projects or intention in the region, they have to work with the GCC, and they have to work with Saudi. And therefore, it's not going to be good if they're going to be anti anybody. The last point I will say about Israel, I think there's a real significant fundamental change of perception of Israel within Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia, of course, when it comes to people, the domestic perception of Israel in itself is something that, the last time I remember this kind of anti-Israeli sentiment was perhaps in the second Intifada in the early 2000s. This is how negative I think people have perceived Israel, and the sentiment has changed. Moreover, just like what Omar mentioned, the Palestinian issue is not only something the Saudis will pride themselves on for Palestinians or Arab or Islamic rights, but it's actually a Saudi issue. The way they project their leadership is this kind of defender of these causes. And this is becoming more and more entrenched in Saudi identity and the Saudi nationalistic discourses. And that's how the Palestinian-Israeli issue is fitting or positioning itself within the Saudi discourse and projection. And the third thing I would say, notwithstanding all the military success that Israel had, which is undisputed, I think. But again, tactical is different than strategic, because Saudi does not see enough strategic utility in normalizing relations with Israel outside of a Palestinian issue. It finds it too much of a security burden, in fact, because the way it's going to complicate the relations for Saudi Arabia is just too much. And hence why, when it came to the discussions of normalization, Saudi required security guarantees from the United States, because that's where the security strategic utility Saudi sees. The last point, and I keep saying last point, the last point is also how normalization and Abraham Accords is playing out within Israel before October 7th. And this is something I think is very interesting, because I think the Abraham Accords, Saudi-Israeli normalization, was viewed as the ultimate circumnavigation of the Palestinian issue. And therefore, it would have kind of framed it as sort of the ultimate success. And so there is just such a big gap between what people wanted from the Abraham Accords and what people in the Gulf, in Abu Dhabi and in Bahrain, or in Israel. I mean, when you have Ben Gvir saying, great job, and high-fiving people and saying, peace is great, Abraham Accords, we need more peace. This tells you, I think, how the Abraham Accords is being played out and understood inside the Israeli political dynamic, which is very interesting, because what that will do is that will complicate relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because I think still Iran will still listen to what's happening in some of these circles, and they will say, just like what Ahmed referred to, like, hey, if we have relations with these countries, we can now strike you from anywhere in the Gulf. And that means a regional insecurity rather than regional security. So language and discourse and how people are interpreting kind of regional relations in their domestic capitals is something also that has strategic ramifications, which goes back to what the question you said earlier.
This next question is from a member of our audience, Nick Bosdev, who's with the Naval War College and Foreign Policy Research Institute. Do the Gulf states want to preserve Iran as a balance against Israel, even in a diminished capacity? And what role for China in the region to balance the United States? Omar?
Okay, so I don't think so. This is the case. We need to understand that the Gulf states, they're going on a statecraft. They are projecting a statecraft that is more economic oriented, more connectivity oriented, and it's not security oriented. This is what they're trying to do, and this is one thing I forgot to add, that Saudi Vision 2030, it's principally oriented around stability and peace in the region. And they don't, as Aziz was saying, they are no longer interested in becoming part of this game of undermining Iran or undermining this nation or that nation. And they have already done this in the last 2 decades, and nothing came out of it. The only thing that came out of it was the attack on Saudi oil infrastructure, and preserving Iran. I mean, what will that amount to then? A stronger Iran? They have already seen that stronger Iran. And the problem with that theory is that if Israel-Iran conflict escalates, then, as Aziz was saying, Saudi Arabia is in the middle. Then how long can you stay immune from that? And with regards to China, I think that till now, China has not really put down itself in a strategic manner as a mediator, or it did in between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but I think that only happened after considerable work was done by both sides in terms of engagement and some sort of modus operandi. And then China kind of sealed the deal, if we may say so. But other than that, there is no security footprint of China as such within the region. So I don't know how can China actually influence or deliver anything. The economic footprint is there definitely, but then again, China has not really tried to translate it into a more comprehensive political influence, and actually has tried to work under the shadow of U.S. Security infrastructure. So China is pretty fine in, as a colleague, an expert of Chinese affairs in Gulf, Jonathan Fulton, has said, that it's actually very happy by utilizing the space created by U.S. Dominated security infrastructure in the Gulf region to do trade, to engage with Iran and the Arab Gulf states. And also, China would definitely not be happy if such a conflict escalates in any direction further. So, but I have not seen any sort of footprint right now from the Chinese side to become a security actor within the Gulf region. It is in other regions, like in South Asia, but not definitely in the Gulf.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just to add to what Umar was saying, I wanted to mention also the perception. This is an opportunity to talk about just about the perception of the Gulf and the United States. There's a lot of multipolarity discussion. You know, we're talking about multipolarity and there is a multipolarity here. But when it comes to the aspect of security, I think notwithstanding the discussions and the frustrations that Gulf states have maybe with the United States, sometimes the anxieties that they have, I think there's still a strong preference for the United States to work. They're still the #1 priority. And I think this is one thing that I think that's important to note, because in the previous years, there's a lot of this discussion about multipolarity, and then Saudis, you know, oh, we're going to look elsewhere and we're going to change that. Saudi and the GCC states still see the United States as still their main and top security guarantor. That's not going to change. And, you know, but relations and international relations has developed, and it became far more interconnected and far more diverse. There's a diversification of strategies and diversification of relations with other powers. But when it comes to this aspect, and this is what I would call it, the lens, the international security lens that Saudi may see is in an asymmetric multipolar lens. This is what I would call it. And what do I mean by that is that notwithstanding the fact that there are different players out there for security and economy, but for security, it sees still the United States as the top option that it wants to work with. And I don't see that changing. And I think China will, I don't really see that anytime in the near future that China will eclipse this role of the United States that has.
So we only have a couple of minutes left in the hour, and I think I might run just a couple over if that's okay with both of you, because there's one question that I wanted to get back to, and if you could keep this brief, it would be appreciated. But the mowing the lawn concept, where we have a series of strikes on Iran, they try to reconstitute their program, Israel hits them again, the U.S. may end up involved again. If that is how things play out in the next couple of years, what would be the Saudi and broader Gulf responses to that? Obviously, it's uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say this quickly. I think it is uncomfortable, and this is exactly the definition of what the Saudis and the GCC states don't want, which is regional instability, which it hinders not just the regional projects, but the domestic projects that require regional stability. And that's something that Umar mentioned. And let me just say why that's so important, because Saudi, you know, this war and the regional insecurity has illustrated also how broad the Saudi borders are. You know, the northern border is difficult. The southern border with Yemen, the eastern border, the western border on the Mediterranean, on the Red Sea. The question of economy for Saudi Arabia is not an easy one. It's actually the transformation of the Saudi economy is an existential one for Saudi Arabia, and it needs regional security more than ever. So mowing the lawn, as much as many people think the Saudis will like this is completely the antithesis of what Saudi wants to see.
Omar, did you have anything to briefly add to that?
I think that this concept is really problematic, as he said. And if the mowing is happening in Iran, it can happen anywhere else as well. Because if Iran is done, then if there is another challenger in the region, and then like what, Israel is coming and bombing them as well, it's very, very problematic from a Saudi perspective.
We could keep this discussion going a lot longer, but I probably should wrap up because we're getting to the top of the hour. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here, and thank you to our audience for taking the time to join us. I hope our viewers have found this discussion as enlightening as I did. And I'd like to mention that this discussion will be posted on YouTube and the Center for the National Interest website if anyone wants to recommend it or post a link on social media. Thank you, and this concludes our session.
Thank you, Greg.